This is Birds of Steel, a 2012 flight sim game released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And who was it made by? Yours truly, Gaijin Entertainment. Now previously on the channel, we covered IL-2 Birds of Prey, which was actually the first ever flight sim that was made by Gaijin. It came out 3 years prior to this newer entry, but even then, it still had a heavy dose of gameplay and UI elements that I could recognize as familiar to even modern War Thunder. But trust me when I say, Birds of Steel takes this and cranks it all the way up to 11. This game is literally War Thunder, but for 7th gen consoles. The menus, loading screens, plane models, UI, sound effects, and so much more are quite literally just War Thunder, but packaged conveniently into something that fits on a single disc. We're going to be checking out and playing the game natively on an Xbox 360 today to see what this experience is actually like. Let's get started. If you're watching this video, I'd say there's an extremely high likelihood that you already know what War Thunder is. Think of Birds of Steel as like a slightly toned down version of the War Thunder we know today, except minus the monetization, although Birds of Steel did still have some purchasable items, including DLC. The game has multiple game modes, including a multiplayer that was pretty active at its peak. But I'm happy to report that even if you exclude that multiplayer and just focus on what's offered in the game's offline single-player modes, it's quite impressive. There's a campaign mode where you play through the events of the Pacific Theater of World War II from either the American or Japanese perspective, a missions mode, which has other historical battles, but are more sort of just one-offs. There's a mission editor where you can create your own scenarios, and my personal favorite, a dynamic campaign mode. And of course, don't forget about the aircraft tree, which operates just the way you'd expect it to. You have multiple countries available to choose from to spend your hard-earned silver lions and unlock ever-increasingly effective aircraft. The USA, Germany, USSR, Britain, and Japan are all available, with the tree featuring all the iconic craft you know and love. Altogether, the game's package gives something that's a truly great experience on this old hardware, with the only real sort of negative being the performance, which we'll cover a bit later on. Normally, I would cover story first, but since this game doesn't really have a story in the traditional sense, we're going to cover game modes first. First up is the historical campaign. This, as we mentioned earlier, is where you'll relive some of the biggest moments of the war in the Pacific, from either the American or Japanese perspective, starting with, of course, Pearl Harbor. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to play through these. There's a total of 20 missions if you count both nations, and runtime for these hovers around the 10-minute or less mark. As for the actual content of these missions, I would describe them as very straightforward, with most having just 1 or 2 objectives to complete before finishing them. In between key moments of these, you're presented with in-engine cutscenes that probably looked pretty good for the time, graphically. The amount of enemies on screen at times is also rather impressive, but that isn't really specific to this game mode, as you'll see. All in all, I'd describe the trip through the historical campaigns to be short and sweet. Some of the missions can be a little uneventful, like for instance, the opening of the US campaign at Pearl Harbor just has you flying on patrol to a few waypoints before fending off a couple of Zeros. But there were also some pretty cool moments too, like during the defense of Wake Island, when you and one other Wildcat face off against 39 incoming Japanese aircraft, which is based on a real event, by the way. In between major operations, you're also treated to narrated historical footage that explains the events that are taking place. These were really well done and felt like a sort of mini History Channel segment, sparing no detail and typically being anywhere between 2 to 3 minutes in length.
The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier battle of the war, forced the Japanese to cancel their plans to attack Port Moresby. The battle cost the Americans one of their fleet carriers, the USS Lexington. Yorktown was damaged and had to retreat to Pearl Harbor for repairs. While it was impossible to identify a winner of the Battle of the Coral Sea, this was the first time the Japanese failed to meet their strategic goals. It was a taste of things to come.
While the historical campaigns were good, these were far from the highlight of the game for me. The real fun came with trying out all the different aircraft available in the other game modes. First up is single missions mode, which is sort of like an extension of the historical campaign, except maybe not quite as linear. There are 4 theaters of combat to choose from, the Mediterranean, Western Front, Eastern Front, and the Pacific. Contained within each of these is, you guessed it, more missions to play through. Altogether, these add over 25 additional levels to play and feature all sorts of various objectives, from air-to-air intercepts and ground attacking, to not quite so combat-focused ones like flying down a river, landing on a street, or even trying to wrangle and land the mighty PBY Catalina in the water, which is not easy, by the way. For me, these acted as a sort of extension of the game's main campaign and offer just that much more content to play through. The planes you use in these are still predetermined though, although the variety used is pretty solid. The two game modes that were really the highlight for me though were the mission editor and dynamic campaign. The mission editor allows you to set up custom missions as you see fit. You can choose and customize your combat theater, map, what type of mission you want to run, what you, your allies, and enemies are flying, etc. It's really the ultimate sort of custom versus match setup. Except, unlike in some other games in the genre where the versus mode essentially boils down to just setting up dogfights, here you're creating your very own custom scenario. Dynamic campaign though is really where it's at as far as replayability is concerned. This took me completely by surprise, as up until this point, I haven't played a single other game like this on console that has anything that remotely compares. This is how it works. First, you choose a combat theater. There are 8 available, stretching across all the ones the game offers. Then you set some parameters. The year, which will determine what aircraft are available to fly, which side you're fighting for, Axis or Allied, if you want to give a frontline advantage to either side, and then how many victories it takes to win, and your difficulty. You're then moved to a campaign status screen, which shows info like how many sectors you and your enemies control, and how many units each side possesses. After this, it's time to actually start contributing to the war effort. You're sort of given the freedom to play the types of missions you want. You can choose from a variety, with essentially every mission type in the game being offered. However, you are limited to what missions you can play based on what aircraft you've unlocked. If you don't have the aircraft listed, you can't choose it. As far as the missions themselves, they play out very similarly to the other missions in the game. They're fairly short, mostly clocking in around 10 minutes or less, and you're only required to complete your primary objective in order to get a mission complete. Post-mission, you're sent back to the campaign status screen, where you can then view updated numbers for the campaign. You can also view a battle log here too, that'll show you specifics and break down the results of each battle. From here, it's really just rinse and repeat until you've won enough sectors to obtain victory as defined by the parameters you set when creating your campaign. Upon completion, you get a nice little victory screen that shows you your stats for the run, and your Silver Lions reward, of course. Next, let's just briefly touch on multiplayer. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to partake in any of this, but from what I've seen, it honestly looks like it was both pretty active and loved by its player base. There were PvP modes, such as airfield domination, where both teams would fight for control of an airfield, as well as co-op. If any of you played the game's multiplayer back then, be sure to let me know down below. Specifically, I'm really curious as to what lobbies looked like as far as aircraft were concerned. Was it just completely open and anything went, or were there tier restrictions of some kind? The gameplay I've seen of this looks honestly really solid, and I'm kind of sad that I missed out on this during its heyday. Okay, let's move on to gameplay. How does Birds of Steel feel to play? Well, seeing as how the game is essentially just an early version of War Thunder, it feels really similar, more so even than the game's predecessor, IL-2 Birds of Prey. Aircraft handling here is absolutely top-notch, and really leaps and bounds above anything else in the arcade flight genre. But to be fair to all those other games, I wouldn't really categorize Birds of Steel as one of them, because even on the arcade difficulty or flight model option, this game is much less arcadey than those other offerings. The game can be picked up and played fairly easily, but it's not quite as casual of an experience in my opinion. I was playing with a standard 360 controller, and I'll tell you, it took me a bit of time, maybe an hour or so, to really get used to the way aircraft handled in regards to roll, pitch, and yaw sensitivity in order for me to reliably be able to set up shots. And this all applies even more so if you want to play the game on more realistic difficulty settings. The mouse aim system we have today in Modern War Thunder is far superior. But once you move past the phase of learning to effectively control your aircraft, the game is fun. weapons are satisfying to use, with some feeling a bit overpowered, like really any of the cannons seem to just one-tap anything they touch, with the exception of the Shabaks, which honestly felt a little underpowered to me. But regardless, shooting down enemies feels great, thanks in part to the absolutely superb damage models. When it comes to console flight games, this is basically as good as it gets. While we're talking weapons, I just want to point out too that I thought the way that having multiple caliber weapons on an aircraft was handled was fantastic. If you're flying something that has both machine guns and cannons, slightly pulling the right trigger will fire machine guns only, and fully pulling it will fire both. The game also features a fully remappable control scheme, which is always a huge quality of life improvement for those who want to customize things to their liking. Now, normally in games like this, I tend to always prefer to use third-person view. It just seems to best fit the action and pacing of console flight games, and being restricted to first person tends to limit visibility pretty severely and makes it hard to track targets. But to my surprise, I actually found myself using the first person cockpit view quite a bit here. I don't know if it's the cockpit's field of view, immersion factor, or the fact that the precise movements needed to accurately place shots translates better while in the cockpit, but something about it just feels right to me. It probably doesn't hurt that the cockpits are very detailed, and while not every aircraft has one, most do and feature working gauges, plus they're pretty accurate to how they actually looked and functioned. I'd be interested to see if anyone else out there experienced something similar here. Alright, we can't talk about this game and not talk about the aircraft tree. Birds of Steel offers a really impressive roster of aircraft. From fighters like the Corsair, Bf-109, Spitfire, and Zero, to attackers like the Mosquito and IL-2, and even full-sized bombers. This is hands down the largest variety of aircraft I've ever seen in a console flight game. As a matter of fact, I don't think there are any other titles, excluding War Thunder of course, that come close to this. There's even aircraft customization via the hangar, allowing you to personalize your aircraft as you see fit. And the icing on the cake is that all of this fits on a single disc and it's available without microtransactions of any kind. But of course, to unlock all of these, it's gonna take some grinding. Nowhere near as long as War Thunder proper, but still a decent chunk of time, especially since you earn far less XP in Lions if you're restricted to single player only. I'd say probably around 30 hours at least if you want to unlock everything. In full disclosure, I did not go through that grind for this video due to time purposes. I imported a save that had everything already unlocked. Alright, let's talk presentation. First, we'll cover visuals and performance. Now, keep in mind this was running natively on an Xbox 360 Slim with no upscaling of any sort. I think the game holds up pretty well, considering it's most likely running somewhere around the 720p resolution range, but where it does fall off a bit for me is with its frame rate. 30 FPS is fine, especially when it's a consistent 30 FPS, but in certain scenarios where there was a lot of action on the screen, I did experience some pretty big frame drops. Outside of these moments though, frame rates were fairly consistent, and I'd say it delivered an acceptable experience. The big highlight of the game's presentation though, is the music. If you ever played War Thunder early on, this game literally has that soundtrack. You will not be disappointed. And there's actually still a video live on Gaijin's YouTube page that shows the creation of some of these. Birds of Steel is quickly becoming one of, if not my favorite, console-based flight games. Much like War Thunder, it scratches that itch of wanting to pick up a controller and play something that leans slightly more into realism than your typical arcade flight sim. If you've got a PS3 or Xbox 360 lying around and want to try it out for yourself, you can secure a physical copy for around the $10 to $20 price range. Or, believe it or not, you can actually experience this in modern War Thunder via historical and dynamic campaigns, which are set up in exactly the same manner. Just be aware that you will have to fulfill some prereqs as far as unlocks are concerned, so some multiplayer grinding may be required. Let me know your thoughts on Birds of Steel down below, and as always, thanks for watching. Until next time.